The day Donald Trump slapped a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum, he thought he was throwing a punch at a foreign rival. Instead, he pulled the pin on a grenade and dropped it right into the middle of American factories, and the shrapnel is still flying. The cost to American businesses for every single ton of aluminum they need just exploded by $4,000. $4,000 per ton. That is not a typo. That is not a temporary glitch. That is the price of a policy that was sold as a shield but turned into a sword aimed straight at the heart of American manufacturing. But how did a tax on our closest ally, a country that has fought and died alongside us in every major war for the last century, end up costing American companies more than the aluminum itself is worth? The answer is a story of ego, economics, and a single phone call that changed everything. Stick around, because by the end of this video you will never look at the aluminum in your car, your phone, or your soda can the same way again. Before we dive in, do me a favor. Type the word tariff in the comments right now. It helps the algorithm know you are engaged. And if you are new here, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story that the mainstream media will not tell you. Now, let us rewind the clock to March 2018. The Trump administration announces a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports. The reason given is national security. The target is not just China. It is not just the European Union. It is Canada. Canada, the country that supplies nearly half of all the aluminum consumed in the United States. The country that shares the longest undefended border on the planet. The country that has been a reliable, stable, and friendly supplier of this critical metal for decades. The reaction in Ottawa is not just surprise. It is betrayal. Canadian officials are stunned. They had just spent months renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, trying to preserve a relationship that had been the backbone of both economies for a quarter of a century. And now, in one stroke, the United States is treating Canada like a national security threat. The Canadian Prime Minister calls the tariffs insulting and unacceptable. He promises retaliation. But here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody saw coming. The tariffs do not just make Canadian aluminum more expensive. They break the entire pricing mechanism of aluminum in North America. To understand why, you need to know how aluminum is actually bought and sold. The price of aluminum is not just the base metal price on the London Metal Exchange. There is something called the Midwest Premium. This is the extra cost that buyers in the United States pay to get physical aluminum delivered to their factories. It covers transportation, storage, and the simple reality of supply and demand in the region. Before the tariff, the Midwest Premium was a few $100s per ton. It fluctuated, but it was manageable. When the 10% tariff hits, the immediate effect is that Canadian aluminum, which makes up a huge chunk of the U.S. supply, suddenly costs 10% more at the border. But that is just the start. The tariff also signals to the market that supply is about to get tighter. Traders and distributors start hoarding metal. They anticipate shortages. They start charging more just to hold on to inventory. The Midwest Premium begins to climb, and climb, and climb. Within weeks it surges past $1,000 per ton, then $1,500, then $2,000. By the time the dust settles, the total cost of aluminum for American buyers has increased by up to $4,000 per ton. That is not just the tariff. That is the tariff plus the panic, plus the speculation, plus the broken supply chains. And who pays that $4,000? Not Canada, not China, American companies. The automakers who need aluminum to build lighter, more fuel-efficient cars. The beverage companies who need aluminum for every single can of soda and beer. The construction companies who need aluminum for window frames and siding. The aerospace companies who need aluminum for aircraft parts. Every single one of them sees their input costs skyrocket. And what do? They do not absorb the cost. They pass it on to you, to me, to every consumer in America. The price of a can of soda goes up. The price of a new car goes up. The price of a house goes up. The tariff that was supposed to protect American jobs ends up making everything more expensive for American families, but the damage does not stop at higher prices. The tariff also triggers a chain reaction that destroys jobs in the very industries it was meant to save. Let us look at the auto industry. American car manufacturers rely on a complex cross-border supply chain. Aluminum might be mined in Canada, smelted in the United States, rolled into sheets in Mexico, and then stamped into car parts in Canada again before finally being assembled into a vehicle in the United States. The tariff disrupts this entire flow. Suddenly, every time that aluminum crosses the border, there is a cost, there is a delay, there is uncertainty. Some companies start looking for alternative suppliers, but there are no alternative suppliers that can match the volume and quality of Canadian aluminum on short notice, so they pay the higher price, and then they have to make cuts elsewhere. They delay expansion plans, they freeze hiring, they lay off workers. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that the tariffs on steel and aluminum led to a net loss of jobs in American manufacturing, not a gain, a loss. Because the higher input costs hurt manufacturers more than the tariffs help the relatively small number of steel and aluminum workers. The irony is brutal. The tariff was sold as a way to bring back American aluminum jobs, and yes, a few smelters reopened or expanded. But the number of jobs gained in aluminum production was dwarfed by the number of jobs lost in the industries that use aluminum. For every one job saved in an aluminum smelter, an estimated 15 jobs were lost in downstream manufacturing. 15 to 1. That is not a trade war victory, that is a self-inflicted wound. And then there is the retaliation. Canada did not just sit back and take it. It struck back with a carefully targeted list of tariffs on American products. It chose items that would hurt politically sensitive areas: bourbon from Kentucky, whiskey from Tennessee, steel from Ohio, agricultural products from swing states. The message was clear. If you want a trade war, you will get one, and the pain will be felt in the districts that matter most. The Canadian strategy was not just economic, it was psychological. It was designed to remind American politicians that Canada is not a pushover. It is a sovereign nation with its own interests and its own leverage, and it used that leverage with surgical precision. The tariffs on Canadian aluminum were eventually lifted in 2019 as part of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement negotiations. But the damage was done, the trust was broken, the supply chains were disrupted, and the lesson was learned the hard way. Trade policy is not a game. It is not a reality TV show where you can slap a tariff on something and expect applause. It is a complex, interconnected system where every action has a reaction and every reaction has a cost. And that cost is paid not by the politicians who make the decisions, but by the workers, the businesses, and the consumers who have no choice but to live with the consequences. Now, let us talk about the $4,000 per ton figure. Where does that number come from? It is not just the 10% tariff. The 10% tariff on aluminum was based on the base price of aluminum, which at the time was around $2,000 per ton. So 10% of that is $200. That is a significant amount, but it is not $4,000. The rest comes from the Midwest Premium explosion. The Midwest Premium is the additional cost that buyers in the United States pay for physical delivery. Before the tariff, it was around $200 to $300 per ton. After the tariff, it surged to over $2,000 per ton. Add the $200 tariff to the $2,000 premium increase, and you are looking at a total increase of $2,200. But the actual impact was even worse, because the tariff also caused a ripple effect through the entire supply chain. Transportation costs went up because of delays at the border. Insurance costs went up because of the uncertainty. Inventory costs went up because companies had to stockpile metal to avoid future disruptions. All of these factors pushed the total cost increase to around $4,000 per ton, and for some companies it was even higher. Small and medium-sized businesses that did not have the bargaining power to negotiate better prices were hit the hardest. They were forced to pay whatever the market demanded, and they had no choice but to pass those costs on to their customers. The $4,000 figure is not an exaggeration. It is a documented reality that was reported by industry analysts, trade associations, and even government agencies. The Commerce Department itself acknowledged that the tariffs had led to higher prices for American consumers and businesses. But by then, the political narrative had already been set. The tariff was a success because it looked tough. It looked like action. It looked like someone was finally standing up to foreign competitors. Never mind that the foreign competitor was Canada. Never mind that the action was hurting American workers more than anyone else. The optics were what mattered. And the optics were a lie. Let us zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Aluminum is not just another commodity. It is a strategic metal that is essential for modern life. It is lightweight, corrosion-resistant, and infinitely recyclable. It is used in everything from airplanes to electric vehicles to renewable energy infrastructure. The global aluminum market is worth over $200 billion a year, and the United States is deeply integrated into that market. Canada is the largest supplier of aluminum to the United States, accounting for roughly 45% of all U.S. aluminum imports. The relationship is not just about trade, it is about energy. Canadian aluminum is smelted using hydroelectric power, which makes it some of the cleanest aluminum in the world. American aluminum smelters, on the other hand, rely more on coal and natural gas. So when the tariff hit Canadian aluminum, it did not just raise prices, it also made the U.S. aluminum supply chain dirtier. The environmental impact was completely ignored in the national security justification. The tariff was supposed to protect national security, but it ended up undermining environmental security. It is a perfect example of how a policy can be sold on one set of values while actually violating another. And the national security argument itself was always shaky. The Pentagon did not ask for these tariffs. The Department of Defense actually opposed them because they knew that higher aluminum prices would increase the cost of military equipment. Fighter jets, naval ships, armored vehicles, all of them use aluminum. The tariff was a tax on defense spending. It was a tax on the very military it was supposed to protect. The national security justification was a fig leaf. It was a way to use a legal provision that allowed the president to impose tariffs without congressional approval. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 gives the president the authority to impose tariffs if they are deemed necessary for national security. But that authority was never meant to be used against close allies. It was meant to be used in genuine emergencies, like a war or a blockade. Using it against Canada was an abuse of power, and it set a dangerous precedent. If the United States can call Canada a national security threat, then what is to stop other countries from calling the United States a national security threat? What is to stop China from imposing tariffs on American goods because it does not like our foreign policy? The rules-based international trading system is built on the idea that countries will follow the rules, even when it is inconvenient. When the United States breaks those rules, it gives every other country an excuse to do the same. And that is exactly what happened. The tariff on Canadian aluminum was not just a bilateral dispute. It was a crack in the foundation of the global trading order, and the consequences are still being felt today. Now let us talk about the human cost. Behind every statistic there are real people. There is the factory worker in Ohio who lost her job because her company could not afford the higher aluminum prices. There is the small business owner in Michigan who had to raise prices on his products and lost customers as a result. There is the farmer in Iowa who saw the price of his equipment go up because of the steel and aluminum tariffs. There is the Canadian aluminum smelter worker who watched his industry get caught in the crossfire of a political fight he had nothing to do with. These are not abstractions, they are lives. They are families, they are communities, and they were all hurt by a policy that was supposed to help them. The tariff was sold as a way to level the playing field. But the playing field was already level. Canada was not dumping aluminum on the US market. It was not subsidizing its aluminum industry unfairly. It was simply producing a high-quality product at a competitive price, using clean energy, and selling it to its closest neighbor. That is how trade is supposed to work. Both sides benefit. Both sides grow. Both sides prosper. The tariff destroyed that mutual benefit. It turned a win-win relationship into a lose-lose one, and the worst part is it was completely unnecessary. The United States and Canada could have worked together to address the real challenges in the aluminum market, like overcapacity from China. Instead, they ended up fighting each other while China watched from the sidelines and smiled. The Chinese aluminum industry, which is heavily subsidized and environmentally destructive, was the real threat. But the tariff did nothing to address that. In fact, it made things worse. By making Canadian aluminum more expensive, it made Chinese aluminum relatively more competitive. Some buyers who could not afford the higher Canadian prices turned to Chinese suppliers. So the tariff, which was supposed to protect American industry from foreign competition, actually increased American dependence on Chinese aluminum. The irony is almost too painful to bear. Let us also consider the long-term consequences. Trust once broken is hard to repair. Canada will not forget that the United States treated it as a national security threat. That memory will shape Canadian trade policy for decades to come. Canada has already started diversifying its export markets, looking to Europe and Asia to reduce its dependence on the United States. It has also invested in its own aluminum smelting capacity, using its clean energy advantage to position itself as a supplier of green aluminum. The United States, on the other hand, has lost credibility as a reliable trading partner. Other countries are now wondering if they could be next. If the United States can impose tariffs on Canada, it can impose tariffs on anyone. That uncertainty makes other countries less willing to invest in the United States, less willing to enter into long-term supply agreements, and less willing to cooperate on broader geopolitical issues. The tariff on Canadian aluminum was not just an economic policy, it was a diplomatic disaster, and the cost of that disaster is measured not just in dollars and cents, but in lost opportunities, lost trust, and lost influence. Now I want to take you inside the room where it happened. The decision to impose tariffs on Canadian aluminum was not made in a vacuum. It was the result of intense lobbying by the American aluminum industry, which had been struggling with low prices and foreign competition for years. The industry argued that it needed protection to survive, and that national security depended on having a domestic aluminum supply. The Trump administration listened, but it did not listen to the industries that use aluminum. It did not listen to the automakers, the can makers, the construction companies. It did not listen to the economists who warned that the tariffs would backfire. It did not listen to the Pentagon, which said the tariffs were unnecessary. It listened to a narrow set of interests and made a decision that hurt the broader economy. That is a classic case of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. The benefits of the tariff went to a small number of aluminum producers. The costs were spread across the entire economy. And because the costs were spread so thin, most people did not even realize they were paying them. They just noticed that things got more expensive and wondered why. The aluminum tariff is a textbook example of how not to make trade policy. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring economic reality in pursuit of political optics. And it is a reminder that in a complex, interconnected world, There are no simple solutions. Every action has consequences, every policy has trade-offs, and every decision must be weighed not just against its intended goals, but against its unintended effects. The $4,000 per ton that American businesses paid for aluminum was not just a number. It was the price of ignorance. It was the cost of arrogance. It was the bill for a policy that was designed to look strong but ended up being profoundly weak. And the saddest part is we are still paying it. The supply chains that were disrupted have not fully recovered. The trust that was broken has not been fully restored. The jobs that were lost have not been fully replaced. The tariff may have been lifted, but its shadow lingers. Every time an American company buys aluminum, they are reminded of the lesson that was learned the hard way. Every time a Canadian official sits down at a negotiating table, they remember the betrayal. Every time a consumer pays a higher price for a product that contains aluminum, they are paying a small piece of that $4,000 bill. So the next time someone tells you that tariffs are a simple solution to complex problems, remember this story. Remember the $4,000 per ton. Remember the jobs that were lost. Remember the trust that was broken. Remember the fact that the United States taxed Canada's aluminum and ended up making America pay the price. Because in the end, trade wars are not won. They are just lost in different ways, and the biggest loser is always the person who thought they were throwing a punch, only to find out they were punching themselves in the face. The aluminum tariff was not a bold move. It was a blunder. And it is a blunder that we cannot afford to repeat. The world is watching, the markets are watching, and history is watching. What we do next will determine whether we learn from this mistake or repeat it. The choice is ours. But the cost of getting it wrong is measured in more than dollars and cents. It is measured in the livelihoods of ordinary people, the strength of our alliances, and the future of our economy. So let this be a lesson. Let this be a warning. Let this be the story we tell our children when they ask us what happens when pride trumps prudence, when politics trumps economics, and when a tariff on aluminum ends up costing America $4,000 per ton. The answer is simple. We pay. We all pay. And the bill is still coming due.